Hey, back with another video. The topic I want to talk today is about history itself. So, first off, we recognize that history is usually defined by the victor. So, whoever wins a war tends to be the one that decides to express their point of view of how the war went and why they pursued that war. Usually noble goals and all that, but that's not usually the case. It's usually a lot more complex than that. And sadly, that's the kind of problem that historians have to deal with. They have to deal with the fact that people have their own varying perspectives, and if, for example, civilizations wiped out, how are they to know that there is such a thing as that civilization? Countless civilizations have come and gone, whether they were from a small village to a city-state. We've had cases where there were centuries of history lost because of fires, disasters, war, famine, plague. There are so many things that help make it difficult for historians to be able to properly explore what actually existed in the past. And I mean, it's even up for debate as far as how far back our history as humans go. The problem is there's so much that we don't have available and so much things that could degrade and fall apart over time. I mean, as it is with fossils, it's a little hard to get an accurate determination of how many animals lived during a time period because you're having to hope that these fossilizations occur, and it may take quite a while for them to be effective in coming out. And there are other cases where there were fossils in a place, but they were destroyed by a later disaster. And that's what makes us have a lot of historical inaccuracies that can occur over time. It's an unfortunate thing, but unfortunately it's become a part of how it plays out. And I mean, if you've ever watched a movie involving history, they do tend to be fairly accurate, but there are definite inaccuracies, but there are purposes behind that. For example, if there's going to be a movie made today involving gender roles, they're probably going to put in a bit more of a modern example of that compared to what the accurate equivalent was back then, in part because they can't exactly know what would have been accurate in a case unless it's a very specific person, and they would have some idea of how it would be played out. But outside of that, it's kind of guesswork because you're having to determine, okay, what was the average, and what would the average have done in this case, and what would the exception have done in this case. And it's trying to come up with a reasonable guess as to how it would have played out in the past. I mean, for example, with Jurassic Park movies, they had to deal with coming up with something to be able to meet the expectations of the people. But the thing is, they probably weren't the most scientifically accurate, but there was a purpose behind it because people have always associated dinosaurs with being a bit more on the reptilian lizard appearance kind of side, when in fact they could have had feathers. Now, I can't say for certain which is which because I'm not a paleontologist and I grew up liking dinosaurs, but I can't say much outside of that. Now, when it comes to all of this, historical inaccuracies aren't always the worst thing to have because sometimes you need to put in a modern twist or a modern parallel into a historical environment for us to be able to relate to what the situation might have been back then. Because there are two parts to history. There's the environment that it's set in, and then the humans that are in it. And the thing is, humans tend to follow similar patterns over time, and the majority of the difference is based off of information and resource availability to a person. Because back then, they were pretty smart. They were along the same lines of IQ as us in mental capacity, but the only difference was that they didn't have access to all the information we have access to. Like, a kid today could know more than the most scholarly professor 200 years ago. But it's simply because they have the information at their disposal. They have the resources to find that information. Well, back then, they had to travel continents. They had to take ships months to be to get to where they need to go, to be to get information on just one little topic. Well, today, I could search something up on my computer, and within minutes, I would have more information than it took that scholar 5 years to learn. It's unfortunate, but that's how it plays out. But there is a purpose behind historical inaccuracies. It's to give us the best, even though they know that it might not be completely accurate. They give us the best that they know is accurate to the situation, but still makes it relevant to what we need to understand today. Because you could talk about the agricultural practices during Nazi Germany. I mean, that is historical information, but is it going to help? What's the purpose behind it? And that's why a lot of history textbooks focus on wars, because they tend to be the one thing that we want to avoid. Because you don't see people, and that's why you're given like a paragraph talking about, oh, this was agricultural practices back then during the 1400s, 1500s, whatever. But then we talk about the wars in a bit more detail because we already have progressed past those agricultural practices and they become obsolete. I mean, they're nice to see, but there's a very little practical purpose for us anymore. But war has always had a bit of a reason to be talked about and to be explored, because if we understand war, we understand the most dangerous part of humanity. Because without that understanding, it gives us it doesn't give us a clear picture that we would need for us to be effective in growing as a society. I mean, as it is, we've had, 10, 15 wars for America alone in the last century that we've been a part of. And, I mean, war is seemingly constant and it exists in a relatively continual state. But us learning from it has given us the ability to be able to combat some of the situations that existed before. It's given us a new understanding and appreciation of life and learning how to be able to diplomatically talk with people instead of going straight to violence. And I mean, even now, we especially need that more than ever because of WMDs existing now, and that's causing a lot of concern when it comes to breakdowns in diplomatic channels. It's always fun to be able to learn about the American Revolution, Civil War, or anything like that. But the fact is, when it comes to history, we'll never have a clear picture because there are too many conflicting points of view. In fact, there are entire schools of thought when it came to the Civil War that could justify the South's position in the war. Now, obviously, they weren't the best reasons, but there are people that still defend those reasons, along with others that are outside of what we typically associate with the South's position for the Civil War. There's a lot that goes on when it comes to history, when it comes to war, when it comes to civilizations, because it was made up of many people that contributed, that influenced, that changed the society over time. That's why, in reality, if you compared 1 year of the Roman Empire to the next, it could look a lot different because it's not a static historical period. People lived, people died, people changed, people grew. That's how it has been and how it is always going to be. We are people that learn to define our generation. We are people that learn to define our society and communities. And unfortunately, history textbooks can't reflect that because we don't have enough time in our lives to be able to devote all our lives to learning the life of one other person. We have to devote it to the most effective parts. And unfortunately, that has become a high focus on the fact that war exists, the fact that we need to combat it whenever we can, and that involves us learning why, how, and how to avoid it. I'll leave you for right now. I'll be posting a video in the next few days.